Chip and Griff show. Back for the final week of the regular season. Georgia Tech coming up. Man, it's flown by, hasn't it? Doesn't it seem like just yesterday we're getting ready for Austin P, and now we're getting ready for Georgia Tech, the precursor to Georgia and Alabama in the SEC championship game. But a dangerous game if there ever was one. It always is, as both Mark Richt and Kirby Smart can attest. The last two times Georgia Tech has come in here, they each had teams lose to Georgia Tech teams over which they were heavily favored. Georgia's heavily favored in this one. You wrote earlier this week. Seemed like you were a little surprised that it was a 17.5 point favorite. You seen the line lately?
Haven't seen it lately. No, I haven't looked at it.
But anyway, anytime
I'll check it now.
As you saw with Alabama, that's right. We're in an interactive world. We'll find this stuff out. As we saw with Alabama in the Citadel, which also runs a triple option, it's a dangerous, pain in the butt kind of offense to prepare for and to do well against. And Georgia will be ultimately challenged because Tech's a hot team. Their option is running really, really well right now. I mean, if you look at points and yards, these two teams are almost identical. Offensively, though, the way they skin the cat is it couldn't be any more different. Though Georgia does run the ball a lot, they run and pass, and they run it very differently. And so that's going to be a heck of a game. I always enjoy covering the Georgia Tech game. This will be Mike's first chance, which has been fun to have him on board for all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's been interesting. The line ship, it opened at 17, went up to 17.5, back down to 17, I'm guessing because of the Monty Rice injury. And, when you look at games, you have to look at personnel and matchups. And, of course, last year, Georgia had the SEC Defensive Player, Roquan Smith, SEC Defensive Player of the Year, who had 9 tackles. Okay, well, he's gone. Yeah. And what Georgia did was maximize him. They pretty much, from what I understand, lined him up deep and let him go. Yeah. And Monty Rice has kind of been the closest thing. He's a poor man's Roquan Smith, but he's been the leading tackler, tough guy. I think Monty Rice is kind of an all SEC type in the making. I don't know if I think he's got what it takes to become the SEC Defensive Player of the Year. But he looks like the kind of guy that can work himself into an NFL linebacker.
Yeah,
maybe a little short for that, but he may be able to overcome that with his speed and toughness. But the freak injury during warm-ups, Chip, before the UMass game, he was a designated captain, and you noticed it. He was down there on the sideline with a boot on in the first quarter. Because you said Georgia's one captain short, Mike.
Yeah, I was like, where's Monty Rice? And I knew I'd seen him earlier out on the field in front of the team leading calisthenics, and then all of a sudden he wasn't there. And it's like, what happened? Then he finally showed up on the bench with a boot on. It just kind of par for the course this year. And I love what you said there, a poor man's Roquan Smith, because lest we forget, Roquan Smith wasn't Roquan Smith as a sophomore, which is what Monty Rice is.
Right.
Not only is he just a sophomore, but he's been an injured sophomore most of the year.
Hyperextended knee, missed a game, Chip.
Yeah, I mean he's tough because he had something on his hand half the year. Remember, he had playing. He's just been playing with one thing or another. That's not a small thing in this game. No. How important is inside linebacker play to defending the triple option?
I don't know. And I don't know how much people understand it, but just imagine this. So typically when a defense plays and it's a run play, the whole mentality is swarm, okay? The guys up front have their gap responsibilities. They're responsible for, the A gap or the B gap or the C gap, which would be the gap between where a center and a guard lines up or where a guard and a tackle lines up. Defensive linemen have the responsibilities to make sure nothing comes through their gap. That's called gap responsibility. But beyond that, when you're playing an option team, the quarterback is basically adjusting on the fly as to who he's going to give the ball to by reading if the gap is sound. Is there somebody occupying it? Yes. Okay, I'm going to pull the ball out and I'm going to run to my right. Has that defensive end or has that linebacker, whoever the defense is assigned to me, is that person playing me? Can they stop me from running? No, then I keep it and I take that gap and try and get 4 to 7 yards. And if the answer is yes, there's somebody there, then I pitch it outside to a running back, right? And you go, well, that seems simple enough. Well, there's also a guy going in motion the other way that really creates a situation where every defender has to play his responsibility so that that mentality that we talked about against a conventional offense, where as soon as we see the ball hand off, we all swarm, all of us go there, 3 or 4 of us. Good luck trying to get us to the open field. What the triple option effectively does is make you stay patient until you've played your assignment, your guy. Now you can go. So it's a bit of an equalizer, because if you break an assignment or if you don't handle the guy you're supposed to handle, you're in trouble. And then the genius of Paul Johnson is it's not just one play. There's a half a dozen ways you can run the same play with different motions, different blocking schemes. And it's like Pat Narduzzi, the ACC Coastal Division champ, was explaining. They kind of see what you're doing, go, oh, you're playing it that way? Okay, now we're going to do this. And then the defense has to change up how they're playing it. And Paul Johnson watches it and he says, oh, okay, now we're going to adjust to this.
Yeah.
So it's a constant fluid matchup. It's not like, oh, we shut them down today.
Yeah.
And Georgia Tech has very experienced and skilled guys doing this, Chip, and you can't replicate what they do in practice. As Kirby's saying has been, they've got a doctorate in this.
Yeah.
Whereas Georgia's pretty much cramming in 1 week.
Yeah, they're cramming for a crip course, as freshmen, because this is a young defense after all. And that's kind of the tough part about it, is you do have a young defense, and you have a young defense that had matured significantly from the first third of the season to the last third of the season. But now that's kind of all out the window. Now they're all freshmen again, trying to figure this out. Now the flip side, we're not sitting here saying doomsday, Georgia doesn't have a chance. On the flip side, they got to stop you too. And that's why ultimately I think this may be a somewhat high-scoring game. The reason I say somewhat is it's not like you can get a shootout with these guys, because it takes them a long time to score. And while it takes them a long, generally, now they can hit you with some big plays really fast, especially when they throw off of that option. Very rarely, but they tend to be wide open when they do.
If they see someone's not playing their assignment,
or those safeties are cheating up, then they're like, okay, we'll run past you. But they do have to stop Georgia on the flip side, and as long as Georgia takes advantage of the opportunities they have, doesn't ever spit the ball out, because your opportunities are precious in this game.
Don't stop yourself.
Don't stop. You got to let them stop you. And don't ever stop yourself with a turnover. That's what happened a couple of years ago. You weren't here for it. I guess it was 2016 game when Nick Chubb and Sony Michel both had fumbles inside their 1 yard line. Georgia lost, and at the very end when they couldn't get the ball back on a 10-minute drive. Lost 28-27.
Like a 95-yard drive, right?
Yeah. So that's the danger of it. And look. It is clean, old-fashioned hate. But what nobody says about this rivalry is it's clean, old-fashioned respect, because the fan bases, especially those who've been around for a long time, I've been around a long time, but, guys like Jeff Danzler and Dave Johnson that you talk to on 960 The Ref and everything, these guys have been around. Tech scares them to death, and it should, because it's just you win 14 out of 17 in the series, but it's just those 3 times, that they can just totally screw you up. And Georgia has a lot to lose on this game. Yeah, they're going to go to the SEC championship game regardless. They're going to play Alabama regardless, but everything, the rug is pulled out from under them if you lose to a 7-4 Georgia Tech
team. You could
right?
lose the Georgia Tech chip and beat Alabama and not make the playoff.
Yeah.
That's what would happen, because you'd have 2 losses.
I could see
that. And
that.
Alabama might even go with 1 loss, even if Georgia beat them.
Right.
Depending on how things play out with Michigan.
Oh God, how much controversy would that be if you beat Alabama barely, but you had lost the Tech, but Alabama goes ahead and goes.
They got 1 loss and
dropped
you got 2.
From 1 to 4, and they go ahead and go.
That could happen, So it's a matter of guys staying focused and I sense that, and I've said all year the thing I like about this team, and I was glad to hear Kirby say this. Last week, somebody said, what did he like most about this team? And he said the buy-in. And that was something that I said I've noticed from the time I've gotten here, is how consistent this team has been in terms of their focus and their effort. And listen, even the LSU game, that wasn't about focus and effort. That was about getting beat by a better team and having a bad day on offense, defense, and coaching booth. So, but right now I see Georgia really dialed in. We see some guys. I wrote a story last night, Chip. Jamari Saylor, a guy that you've talked about for a long time, a 5-star guy from Pace Academy in Atlanta. He's now emerging. You just say to yourself, boy, if only they had the defensive, Jordan Davis was one, but if only Georgia had the same sort of defensive line that they had on the offensive line, They might be a favorite to win the national title and instead of just a
Be
contender.
undefeated right now. I mean,
Yeah, those
except
fourth
for
and
those
ones,
blips.
four times against LSU.
We got a lot of people on here today. We appreciate y'all hanging out. We'll try to get to some of your questions. One gentleman here asked me, do I think Georgia, do we think that Georgia is the number one team in the country? No, I think that's an easy no. I think there are better teams. That doesn't mean Georgia's not capable of winning at
Well,
all.
You know what? Last year, Georgia was the best team in the country, and they didn't win the national title.
Yeah,
Alabama shouldn't have got in. But hey, if you get in the playoff, anything can happen. So last year, Georgia was the best team in college football, won the SEC, came through the front door, played the most difficult playoff game against Oklahoma, had to fly all the way out to Los Angeles, and lost on a kind of a fluky deal there with a guy breaking an assignment on a 2nd and 26. The best team doesn't always win. So the most important thing, Chip, is just can Georgia get in the college football playoff?
John William Adams wants to know what's the ratio. What ratio do you expect UGA pass to throw for this game? I think they always try to achieve pretty even balance on that front. I would imagine that Tech is pretty vulnerable to Georgia's pass game. I don't think they defended a pass game of this sophistication, both in scheme and in talent. But then again, there's a lot of ways Georgia will keep it on the ground as long as they're having success.
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on what the score is. I mean, if Georgia Tech is somehow ahead, Georgia's going to throw the ball more.
Yeah.
Obviously, if Georgia builds a lead, then Kirby's going to run clock.
Yeah. Who was it that said here? Let me see if I can find it. Was it John McMillan who says, "Oh, Bobby Riles says I can't stand watching Tech. It's like watching a replay 65 times in a game." And it is. That's the thing. It kind of lulls you to sleep. It lulls you to sleep as a defense. Hey, you think you've seen, the same thing several times, and you got to stop. And then the next thing you know, they give it to the B back in the B gap instead of the A gap. And the next thing you know, you're not bored anymore. Who will be the home team in the SEC championship? I'm trying to remember who was the home team last year.
What color
was Georgia in red or white last year? I think they were in white for some reason.
Yeah.
Somebody tell us so we don't have a chance to look here.
I think they were in white in the SEC.
No, just look and see what colors they were in the pictures from the SEC championship. You want to look it up?
Yeah, I'll look it up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Kirby and his staff do have some special things up their sleeve for Alabama. They're always holding stuff like that, and I would imagine they do, and I would imagine Alabama does too. Hello, Mike Mizell. David Willoughby's talking about the cut blocks. We'll be lucky to come out with any injuries, and that's part of the scheme.
Jonathan Ledbetter said that the coaches told the Georgia players that there's no data that suggests that they're any more at risk for injuries against this team than they are any other game. They've gone back and they've done the research, so they've told their players. That's what they told their players.
Looks Georgia will be in red this year, according to Jeremy Neighbors. Is that like that? No, they were wearing red in the SEC championship.
No, that looks like, they're wearing red there. I don't know which game that is. I don't know. We'll figure it out. It's hard to find the images for the SEC title game.
Let's see. Tech is a 3-card Monty offense. That's a very good description, John William Adams. I like it a lot. Derek Tillman points out that Tyler Simmons was on sides.
Yeah. So I guess Georgia was in white last year against Auburn. Connor Riley's confirmed that. I guess that means it's the East's turn. I'm not sure. Is that how they do it, or do they do the highest ranked team? I'm not real sure on what.
Hey, great question. That's why we love these interactive meetings. Yeah. We'll get to the bottom of it. We'll call the SEC and check it out. Alan Verbonic says they wore red.
Now they were in the white.
Mike Morrow says Georgia was in white during the SEC. Yeah, so we're getting consensus on they were white last year, which should mean they're wearing red this year. We do know that they will be wearing red on Saturday. I guess they will. I hadn't heard anything about a blackout.
No, don't get that.
I thought for sure if it was going to happen, it was going to happen to UMass, and it didn't happen. So I don't think there's going to be a blackout this year. Maybe in a bowl game, if they end up going to a bowl game and not a playoff. Which is interesting. We haven't really weighed in on that. Bowl possibilities.
Citrus Bowl.
Citrus Bowl could happen.
If Georgia beats Georgia Tech and loses to Alabama, I think they'll go to a New Year's Six bowl. And if LSU beats Texas A&M, I think LSU would finish ranked ahead of Georgia and go to the Sugar Bowl. And I think Georgia would be an at-large team that would go to the Fiesta Bowl and play UCF. If Georgia doesn't make a New Year's Six bowl for whatever reason, I think the furthest they can fall is the Citrus Bowl in Orlando.
Yeah, the Citrus is now there to protect the SEC loser from going any farther down.
So assuming Michigan makes the playoff, the next highest ranked Big Ten team would go to the Rose Bowl, which I guess even if Ohio State loses, are we thinking that they would be the next highest ranked team? Probably yes.
Yeah.
So that would mean, maybe Penn State or I would think maybe Penn State or Iowa in the Citrus Bowl could be waiting for Georgia. If Georgia doesn't make a New Year's Six, I still think the most likely scenario is a Fiesta Bowl trip against UCF.
Chris Snow is pointing out there was the 2014 Tech game that Nick and Sony fumbled. Eason had the interception in the 2016 game. You're right. Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you clearing that up. And the reality is that they were both turnovers, and that's the problem. Mike Mizell says, let's do a blackout. So it's now officially started.
I don't think Kirby's going to go for that.
What else we want to talk about? You had a good story on Dog Nation today. We finally heard from Demetrius Robertson, not really directly about, Demetrius Robertson, but he was quoted. It was actually a nice little piece that UGA put together on his wide receiver core. That's on Dog Nation right now. I got in and weighed in on the Rodrigo Blankenship ridiculously left off of the Lou Groza Award finalist list, which in my opinion, has tainted the award. And you can go there and read that. But I mean, there's a lot of reasons that Rodrigo should have been included, at least in the finalist. I mean, at the end of the day, you might be able to pick the Syracuse guy over him as the overall winner. But it's not even close with Cole Tracy and the kid from Wyoming, Connor Roth, I think it was. So that's a couple of things that you can read right now. We'll be over at the football complex covering the practice this afternoon. Have a lot more reports from there. We'll get out and see practice a little bit. We'll have Kirby and a couple of players. We know who we're talking to after practice.
Don't know, Chip, but some news I just got. Sam Pittman, one of 15 finalists for the Broyles Award, which goes to the best assistant coach on staff. So the other ones are David Reeves, who I believe was Lane Kiffin's brother-in-law. He was caught up in all that.
That's right.
All the NCAA violations that Lane Kiffin committed.
Where is he now?
Tennessee. UAB. They've had a really good season.
Okay.
Mike Loxley, the offensive coordinator at Alabama. Jay Bateman, Army defensive coordinator. Tim DeRuiter, California defensive coordinator. Central Florida, Glenn Ellerby, offensive line coach. Clemson, Jeff Scott, co-offensive coordinator. We mentioned Coach Pittman. LSU's Dave Aranda. He certainly earned his money against Georgia, where he shut him down with his defense. Don Brown, defensive coordinator at Michigan. Bob Shoop at Mississippi State, defensive coordinator.
They've had a great defense this year.
Chip Long at Notre Dame, the offensive coordinator. Bill Bedenbaugh, co-offensive coordinator, Oklahoma. Utah State, David Yost, offensive coordinator. Washington State, Tracy Cleese, that's a guy, defensive coordinator. Wasn't he at Minnesota? Wasn't he head coach Minnesota? And Jake Spativadol, the offensive coordinator at West Virginia. Those are the 15 semifinalists. We saw DeAndre Baker was one of 3 finalists for the Thorpe Award. We know that Jake Fromm was one of 16 semifinalists for the Davey O'Brien Quarterback Award. But for the most part, Georgia really kind of overlooked, I think, Chip. Nobody made preseason first-team All-SEC, and I haven't really seen any Kirby Smart Coach of the Year momentum. And that kind of surprises me when you consider all that Georgia lost. Didn't have anybody that was deemed a preseason first-team All-SEC player, and he's sitting here 10-1 again on the verge of the SEC title game. I would think, ranked number 5.
Yeah, Griff pointed that out to me in the phone call earlier today. We were talking about all these end-of-the-year awards, and Sam Pittman, look, if Georgia ends up certainly winning the SEC championship, he would be deserving of the Frank Broyles Award. He's just done an unbelievable job, not only with a young rebuilding offensive line, but one that's dealt with injury absolutely all year long. And at the end of the day, he's the one that's getting these recruits all to come to Georgia. But as Griff pointed out, he said, nobody's talking about Kirby Smart for Coach of the Year, and perhaps they should be. I mean, this was not expected to be a great Georgia team this year. In the grand scheme of things, it was a transition team, a rebuilding team from 2017 that lost 31 seniors and 2 NFL backs.
31 seniors.
31 seniors, including all the walk-ons. And while that's downplayed, when you've got a walk-on who's been here 4 or 5 years,
Scout team.
I mean, he knows what he's doing, every week in practice. So, yeah, 31 seniors in all. And then, as you pointed out, 2 starting NFL backs, a starting NFL outside
Go-to wide
linebacker,
receiver, your leading receiver, half your secondary,
Yeah.
5 of your starting front 7 on defense, SEC Defensive Player of the Year. And didn't you have to replace a coach or 2?
Yeah, a couple coaches. And that's why I say, look, everything is still in front of Georgia. I think we've all seen enough to know that they might not be the best team in all of college football this year, but that doesn't mean A, that they can't win it. But B, I think what it means ultimately is Georgia is ahead of schedule. Kirby hates that. He says, I ain't got no schedule. He said that last year. The reality is, from him coming in, replacing Mark Richt as the coach, and then recruiting 6, 3, and 1 national classes, Georgia's ahead of the game. And next year they ought to be loaded for bear, as we like to say around
Well,
here.
they should, but injuries happen. That's why you got to take advantage of the opportunities while you got them. There's nothing to say that Georgia's going to be in this. You would think they are. We think they're going to be winning the SEC East every year for 3 or 4 more years. But things happen, and the schedule being what it is, Georgia's at a bit of a disadvantage. They have one less recruiting weekend. Than all but one other team in the SEC. 12 out of 14 teams get an extra SEC recruiting weekend every 2 years than Georgia. They travel one extra weekend for conference play, more than any other team but one in the league. That puts you at a disadvantage when you're.
Well, at least, and often I think Auburn ends up somehow with 8 home games in certain years. I don't know if that's still the case with them.
Well, they may not be. Their home and home rivalry is in conference, whereas Georgia's rivalry, they have a non-conference home and home.
Every other year they get 8 home games.
Yeah, I mean, you're playing
7 and then 8.
You're playing Georgia Tech in Atlanta every other year in a game that really doesn't benefit you. From a national exposure standpoint, it's a noon game, Chip. I mean, it's not a marquee game. You're in the noon game. Vanderbilt and Tennessee have a better time slot than Georgia Tech.
I wonder if this Will Stoff guy is on here. No, this is too fun feeding the puppies. We must have a techie infiltration or Bama. He's got a few comments on here. Maybe Georgia will figure out the red zone when Bama is up on them by 20 points. Yeah, it must be a. Well, welcome, Will Stoff. We're glad to have you here. Hang out, talking about Georgia sports. Give us some constructive criticism.
Yeah, the red zone has been an issue. The last game they did well, but it was UMass, and Kirby didn't make a lot out of that. But I think that Justin Fields, Justin is 4 for 4 in 3rd and 1 or 4th and 1.
Yeah.
I think that's the guy that can solve a lot of those issues in short yardage and red zone. And even bigger than that, what Justin Fields is doing by handling that package, being a team guy, it sends a message to all the freshmanship and all the players on the team that, it's Georgia's at a point in the season where everybody has to be willing to play their role. Now, listen, Justin Fields didn't come here to be a Wildcat quarterback.
Yeah.
He's a future NFL quarterback, for goodness sakes. We all know that. But he recognizes that at this stage of his career, at this point in the season, that's where he'd be more effective. I mean, look at Nick Saban, right? He didn't even play Tua against Auburn last year. They're down 12 points or 14 points with 12 minutes left. And Saban's got the best quarterback on the bench. I don't know what Will thinks about that, but that ain't Coach of the Year material when you had Tua benched all year. I mean, who knows if Tua plays that
clearly he
game.
knew what he was talking about. The Auburn game wasn't important, right? He knew Georgia was going to take care of it.
I guess I'm just saying, Kirby has at least gotten, Fields to play the package. Saban wouldn't use Tua until the playoff, and it was almost too late. They barely used him in time. And the thing is, if he doesn't make the move, we never know just what a bad job Nick Saban did by not playing that guy. That was a big bone of contention. Talking to people that were on that staff that may not be there anymore.
Yeah.
That's why they lost their offensive coordinator. Dabo was trying to tell Saban, hey, this Tua guy. Saban was so stubborn he wouldn't play him, and it did cost him an SEC title, I contend.
Yeah.
And it almost cost him a national championship.
Yeah. And we had a question a little earlier. I've lost them on the number of people we have on here about. I mean, do you see Kirby deploying Justin Fields the way Saban did Tua in the national championship game? And my answer to that would be like, yeah. I mean, I think they're going to deploy Justin Fields in whatever way, shape, or form they can.
Big
Whether
difference,
that's
though.
third and short, or whether Jake Fromm's having a bad day, and
Yeah, there's a big difference, though. Going from Jalen Hurts, the guy that couldn't throw the ball, to the guy that could throw the ball.
yeah,
Jake Fromm is the better thrower right now because he reads defenses and he can get through his progressions. And against Alabama's fronts, Jake's the one that can identify blitzes and changes protections and doesn't have delay of game penalties and doesn't take as high a propensity for sacks as Justin Fields. So could Justin ultimately be the answer? Yes, but it's not quite as crystal clear. I mean, Tua is far and away better than Jalen Hurts, who should have never been the offensive player of the year in the league, completely a byproduct of the system. Whereas Jake Fromm is the quarterback's quarterback. Fields is growing into that role still, Chip. He can run the ball, yes, but Fields is still growing into that role as a field general and a manager of an offense.
Deepak Khanna says, "What's Paul Johnson's record against UGA?" Again, good question. However many years he's been there. All I know is he's 2-0 in his last two trips.
Yeah, all
to
I know
Athens.
is Georgia hadn't beat
Two of the
Georgia
last
Tech
four.
in Athens since 2012. That does not sound good.
That's right. Let's see. Cole Rossiter calling it now. CKS will have an option zone read scheme for Bama. I'm sure they will for some of that goal line situation. I think they've just been holding that out till.
Boy, it's really hard to get the timing of that down, Chip, when you work everything else. I mean, unless you do it week in and week out, it's a gamble because one bad pitch and you go from the smartest guy in the house to the dumbest.
That's true. And then, and as we know, Bama has a penchant for scooping up loose balls and going the other way with them. What else we got? What other story? What are the other storylines on Georgia Tech this week? It's Thanksgiving. I hope you got Thanksgiving plans. I've got some Thanksgiving plans locally. What other storylines we have coming?
Georgia basketball playing in the Cayman Islands opened up with a win over Illinois State.
Yeah, and so they're running headlong into Clemson. One, right?
Yeah, playing an ACC team will be a good test.
That'll be a good one.
Tom Crean and company. Their only loss up there at Temple this year.
76 miles between him and Georgia and Clemson go to the Cayman Islands to play each other.
Yeah, well, it's a nice little preseason tournament. Those guys have worked really hard for Coach Crean, and really the support over there at Stegman's been really impressive, Chip. I mean, from early on, the Stegmania fan event that they had, and then you moved on and you had that opener that drew like almost 10,000 people. It was the largest opener, I think, in over 20 years in attendance. And then you were at a game, I think, that had a pretty good listed attendance.
It was 7195, I think it was. And it looked legit to me.
Sam Houston State.
Yeah, I was going like, wow, this is pretty impressive. Yeah, Georgia's those the biggest attendance for back-to-back home games since the Herrick era, I think.
Since Jim Herrick was
since Jim
Herrick.
Herrick.
The millennium.
That's right. Early 2002, 2003, something like that.
So, but the football is the dominant talk, and tonight the college football playoff rankings come out again, Chip. I expect that Michigan will stay ahead of Georgia, even though the number one defense in the country gave up 20 points to Indiana, and they had to come from behind to beat Indiana at home. I hate to say it. I just feel like I would much rather see the BCS formula because I don't trust those people. I think they could be influenced by what television wants. I think they're influenced by ratings. I think they're influenced by geographical politics. They want Michigan ahead of Georgia, whether Michigan's better than Georgia or not. They don't want two SEC teams. They want to have as much regional representation as they can. Because when I asked the guy point blank on the teleconference last week why Michigan was ahead of Georgia, he said, well, they beat Michigan State and Northwestern and Penn State. Okay, I'll give you Penn State. Northwestern lost at home to Akron and Duke.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. And that's the best team in the West of it. Michigan State, and listen, I went there and I covered the Spartans, but their offense is worse than any offense in the SEC.
Very unusual.
It's horrible. They just lost at Nebraska 9-6. They have a depleted offensive line, an injured quarterback, and the running back is hurt. And they're just the most depleted team I've seen in a Power 5 conference offense all year. So those wins aren't that impressive. Michigan's defense may be number one statistically, but you line them up against 2 in Alabama tomorrow. You line them up against Georgia tomorrow, and the Dogs are scoring 30. So this whole Big Ten whitewash is a bunch of bunk. Remember, Vanderbilt played Notre Dame 22-17, closer than Michigan did, 24-17. The last place team in the East Division gave Notre Dame a better game, than Michigan did.
I'm assuming that committee has all this data, right?
Well, they have the data. Listen, the numbers can lie. You can look at the numbers and make them. They have the #1 defense in the country. What does that mean? Does that mean that Georgia Tech should be ranked in the top 20 because they have the #1 rushing attack in the country? Should Army be in there because of their statistics?
Yeah.
So they can pick and choose whatever they want, but at the end of the day, it's politics, and I don't like it.
Yeah. The other thing to also think about, so Georgia's only lost is, on the road at LSU. But since then they had 3 straight, you could argue, top 10
teams,
top 10 wins. Since then, and you look at the Eastern Division versus the Western Division this year. The Eastern Division actually has
a
winning record.
One of us should do that.
I actually have that data and have actually intended to write something about it.
I'll
probably have that. Also, I think I'm going to do Terry Godwin as my senior profile on.
You know who called that, by the way? You know who said before the year that the East was going to be better than the West?
Was it you?
No, it was Dan Mullen at the Bruce Arians golf tournament.
Okay, yeah,
we've got
right.
Dan Mullen on video, and everybody's that Dan Mullen. Yeah,
that was kind of one of your first gigs.
It was. In fact, I remember I talked to Kirk Herbstreit and did an article on it, and Herbstreit felt like that was still a week away. So we've got some links for you, Chip.
Right.
When you write that story, we can go back and see what Kirk Herbstreit said.
Hyperlink those things. One of those related things.
Yeah, that's a great way. If you jump in on a story now, one of the cool things about the internet, you've got your own little category. You can do your own research by hitting those related links. You read a story, and sometimes you need more perspective or background. It's good to click those links to see, like, particularly this Demetrius Robertson story today. Why is it such a big deal that Demetrius Robertson finally talked? Why is it such a big deal that Kirby Smart says the expectations were outrageous? Well, you need to kind of go back and read what the vibe was back in August when they first got him, Chip. I think we all thought Demetrius Robertson was going to be an impact player.
I certainly did, based on everything I'd heard and actually what I saw in the early go. And we're going to end on this question. We need to wrap it up. We're getting the wrap up sign here. When Georgia this is Cecil Joe Walker wants to know, when Georgia beats Bama, will they both go into the national championship playoffs? So if Georgia were to beat Alabama, that'd be their only loss.
If Clemson were to lose to South Carolina or Pitt in the ACC championship game, if Michigan were to lose to Ohio State or Northwestern in the Big Ten championship game, if Notre Dame were to lose to USC, the answer would be yes. But if all 3 of those teams went out and Georgia beats Alabama, I do think they would keep Alabama out this year.
Yeah, and probably just to spite them, even if you're sitting there looking at the eye test, and if Georgia plays as well as we think they would have to beat Alabama.
Who else do you squeeze out?
Yeah,
I mean, you couldn't keep Georgia out if they beat Alabama with 1 loss.
No.
You couldn't keep Michigan. They certainly wouldn't do that, just because I told you the politics of it, even though Michigan would be the lesser of those 4 teams. Clemson has proven that they can play and won a national title. They wouldn't be left out undefeated. And an undefeated Notre Dame doesn't get left out. So that's kind of the scenario to root for if you really want to see this committee squirm. And they might just go hightail it and get the numbers and the BCS back, because they wouldn't have to want to answer those questions, because Bama Nation and Paul Feinbaum would be on fire.
Yeah,
if Georgia beats Alabama and Alabama gets left out.
Oh, they would. We're going to wrap it up here. Like I said, we'll have lots more coverage today. There's lots of stuff to read on Dog Nation now if you hadn't had a chance to read. Be sure, if you don't have the app on your phone already, you need to get it, because that's the quickest way to know when Mike or me or Jeff Sentell or Brandon Adams post some new copy, some new stories up there. And we'll have a lot of new stuff going up this afternoon, including some of the stories we discussed here. So for the guys back in the studio in Atlanta, for Mike and for Griff and Chip here in Athens, we say thanks for hanging out. We will catch you next time, this time next week at roughly the same time. See you then.